Okay, so on earlier in the week or last week, we learned about special products. Now we're going to be learning about factoring special polynomials. So we're going to be working in reverse again. So last week when we learned about special products, we were given something like x plus 2 and all squared. And we learned our special way where we could square the first term and then find the product of the two terms and then double it. So that would be 4x, right? And then square the last term, which would be 4. Now we're going to be working in reverse. We're going to be taking this trinomial and making it a binomial squared. And then we also learn with the special products like x plus 2 and x minus 2, we only have to do inside outside, remember? So we would get x squared minus 4. So now we're going to be taking this binomial and making 2 binomials with it. Okay, factoring out 2 binomials.
Is this 4?
No, it's fairly easy, I feel like. So what I like to do when I remember this, if you have a trinomial, the longer one, it's going to be a one thing squared. If you only have one thing, a little binomial, you're going to have 2 binomials. Okay? So we're going to work on the second one first here. So the difference of 2 perfect squares. You're going to use if you have 2 terms that are both perfect squares. So both terms have to be perfect squares, and it has to be subtraction. If it's not subtraction, you can't do it. It's considered prime. You take the square root of each term, and you write your answer as a sum and difference of each root. Okay? So for example, we have a squared and b squared. Those are both perfect squares, and it's subtraction. So the square root of a squared is a, the square root of b squared is b, and we make one a sum and one a difference. All right, so is my first term x squared a perfect square? Yes, right? Can I square root x squared and get a single term?
Yes.
X? Yeah. How about 1? Square root of 1 is what? 1. So is that a perfect square?
Yes.
Yes. Is it subtraction?
Yes.
Yes. So I can do our shortcut here where we're going to be square rooting the first term and square rooting the last term, making 2 binomials, one a sum and one a difference. So what is the square root of x? Squared, I'm sorry, is x. So we're going to have x and x. What's the square root of 1?
1.
So we're going to have 1 and 1. Alright, are these both perfect squares?
Yes.
Is it subtraction?
Yes.
Alright, so I'm going to square root the first term, square root the last term, and then make 2 binomials, one positive, one negative. So what's the square root of x squared? X and x. What is the square root of 16?
4.
So 4 and 4. Alright, is 64a squared a perfect square? Can I square root 64? Yes. Can I square root a squared? Yes. Is b squared a perfect square? Yes. Is it subtraction? Yes. It has to be subtraction. If it's not subtraction, it's what? Prime. Alright. So I'm going to square root 64a squared and square root b squared. My answer is going to be the product of a sum and a difference. So what's the square root of 64a squared? 8. 8a and 8a. Okay, what's the square root of b squared? I'm sorry, b. Is 4y squared a perfect square? Is 81 a perfect square? Is it a subtraction? Yes. Alright, so I'm going to square root my first term, square root the last term. Make my answer a product of a sum and a difference. What's the square root of 4y squared? 2y. And what's the square root of 81? So that is finding perfect squared binomials, factoring perfect squared binomials. Okay? So when you have a binomial, you get 2 additional binomials. Okay? When we have a trinomial, we're going to get 1 binomial squared. That's the next one. So factoring perfect squared trinomials. You can still use the x squared or ax squared method, the methods that we have been doing. Because you may not, on your test, you may not identify that it's a perfect squared trinomial. However, if you do identify that it's a perfect square trinomial, you can use the other method. So if you recognize that it's a perfect square trinomial, it has this pattern. The first term is squared, the last term is a square, and the middle term is twice the cross product of the above term. Okay? So let's try this out. All of the ones in our homework and all of these are going to be perfect squares, okay? Trinomials. However, on your test, you may not recognize that it is. So we're gonna factor this one like normal, like how we used to factor. So what would I do first? It doesn't have an A, so what would I have to do? I don't have to multiply A times C, so now I can skip that step. So now I need to factor what? 9. So, and what are my signs going to be? Negative, negative. Your signs are always going to be the same here for if it's a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so 1 times 9 is 9, but that is 10. 3 times 3 is 9, and 3 plus 3 is 6. So, my binomials would be x minus 3 and x minus 3, which would be the same thing as x minus 3 squared. But if we identify that it has it's a perfect square trinomial where it has the first term is squared, it's a perfect squared, the last term is a perfect squared, and then if I were to find the square root of both these terms, so what's the square root of 9? 3, and the square root of x is x squared is x, and that's doubled, would be 6x. But if it's a perfect square in the beginning, it's a perfect square at the end, most likely it's a perfect square trinomial. Okay? All that we have to do is find the square root of the first term. So x squared, the square root of x squared is x. Square root of the last term, and what's the square root of the last term? 3. And then we use the sign from the middle. And then it's all squared. So we can use the shorter method when you know that they're a perfect square trinomial. All of your homework ones will be perfect square trinomials. So you can use the method that we're the shorter method. However, on your test, you may not identify that it is. Okay? Which it's fine just to use the normal method. But we can use the shorter method. So if we square root the first term, and we square root the last term. So what is x squared square rooted? X, and what is 4 squared square rooted? 2, and then we use the sign from the middle. And square, sorry. You have to square. So let's try one of the ones that has an A, the old way. Or do you guys not want to? We'll just do it this way. So I'm going to square root the first term. Square root the last term. So what is 16x squared? 4x. And what is 5 square rooted? Or 25 square rooted? 5. And then what is my sign going to be? Minus, because it's the negative in the middle. Subtraction. And it's all squared. You have to square it. Otherwise, it's not the correct answer. So I'm going to take 4y squared, I'm going to square root it, and I'm going to take 9 and square root it. And what's the square root of 4y squared? 2y. And what's the square root of 9? And then what is my sign going to be? Plus. Addition. And it's all squared.